The world she inhabited between the hours of 5 and 11 was a world of noise. Not the gentle hum of a city waking up, or the soft chirp of crickets at dusk, but a violent, clattering, ceaseless storm of sound. It was the crash of plates being cleared, the high-pitched squeal of a tired espresso machine, the sharp bark of the head chef's voice from the kitchen window, and, above it all, the ceaseless, chattering roar of people who had all the time in the world. She moved through it all, a ghost in a black apron, a carrier of things. Her name was Clara, and at the Gilded Spoon, no one ever really saw her face. They saw a notepad, a pitcher of water, a plate of food arriving, a credit card being taken away. She was a function, a smooth and efficient part of a well-oiled machine. To them, she was just a waitress. The label didn't sting anymore. It was too heavy to sting, more like a dull weight she carried on her shoulders. Her feet, encased in sensible, worn-out shoes, ached with a pain that had become a familiar second heartbeat. She would weave between the tightly packed tables, a balancing act of heavy trays and sharp elbows, her body moving on an instinct honed by 1,000 rushed nights. A man in a pinstripe suit would bark out an order for another martini without looking up from the screen of his phone. A woman dripping in diamonds would snap her fingers for the check, her eyes already scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. They spoke at her, not to her. Their words were commands, their glances were instructions. Clara would nod, a small, practiced smile fixed on her lips, and disappear back into the fray. She was an observer of lives she would only ever see from the other side of a table. She saw the power lunches where men and women in crisp, expensive clothing talked in numbers that were larger than her entire year's salary. She saw the first date awkwardness, where two people tried very hard to seem interesting and successful, their hopes and nerves as palpable as the scent of their perfume. She saw the business dinners, all forced laughter and underlying tension, where a promotion was being celebrated or a departure mourned. She was the keeper of all these tiny, temporary stories, a silent witness to moments of joy, anger, and boredom, and then, just as quickly, she would clear the evidence away with a wet cloth and a bus tub. The name first came to her on a Tuesday. It was a night like any other, the air thick with the smell of sizzling garlic butter and grilled steak. She was refilling the water glasses for two men in their late 40s, their faces flushed from wine and self-importance. They were leaning across the table, their voices low. A conspiratorial rumble that was still loud enough to cut through the general din. "The whole market is reeling," one of them said, swirling the deep red liquid in his glass. But not him. He never reels. He breaks things and rebuilds them in his own image. "The vulture of Silicon Valley," the other one chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "They called him that after the Datalink merger. He swooped in, picked the bones clean, and flew away with the meat." "He didn't just fly away," the first man corrected, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and admiration. "He built a nest with it. A golden, platinum-plated nest. I heard he bought his own island just to land his new jet." Clara's hand paused for a fraction of a second over the water pitcher. She knew the name they were talking about. Julian Vance. It was a name that was always hanging in the air, whispered in financial news segments that played on the televisions above the bar, printed in the business sections of the newspapers left on empty tables. To the people in her world, he was more than a man. He was a force of nature, a billionaire, a titan, the kind of person who existed in a different reality. A place where problems were solved with acquisitions and fortunes were made with a single phone call. He was the embodiment of the world she served, pinnacle of the power and wealth that filled her restaurant night after night. He was a myth. And in her world of aching feet and counting tips, myths were just stories to pass the time. She finished her shift, as she always did, in a state of slow-motion collapse. The last of the customers drifted out into the cool night air, the sounds of their laughter fading away. The staff began the ritual of cleanup. The sound shifted from the roar of the crowd to the clatter and scrape of cleanup silverware being sorted, chairs being stacked on tables, the hiss of the floor squeegee pushing the day's grime toward the drain. Clara counted her tips in a small, dimly lit corner of the break room. The bills were crumpled and slightly damp, smelling faintly of the food they had been tucked next to. It was enough for the rent if she was careful. Enough for groceries if she bought things on sale. It was a life. It was her life. But as she folded the small wad of cash and tucked it into her pocket, a familiar emptiness settled in her chest. A hollow ache that had nothing to do with hunger. She didn't go home to her small apartment. Not yet. Home was a place for sleep, and she wasn't tired in her bones, not the way she needed to be. She was tired in her spirit. Instead, she walked. The streets of the financial district, which had been so alive and aggressive just an hour before, were now quiet and almost serene. The wind whipped around the tall glass buildings, making them hum a low, mournful tune. She walked past dark storefronts and illuminated office buildings where a single light burned in a high window, a testament to someone else's long night. She walked until she reached a different kind of building, one that seemed to have been there long before the steel and glass towers had shot up around it. It was an old hotel, its name carved in faded gold letters over a grand revolving door. The lobby was a cathedral of quiet. At this hour it was empty, save for a lone night clerk behind a polished mahogany desk who barely glanced up as she slipped in. The floors were marble, so clean they reflected the dim crystal chandeliers that hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks. In the center of this vast silent space sat the piano. It was a concert grand, a gleaming beast of black lacquered wood and white ivory that looked both intimidating and inviting. It was a piece of art, a relic from a time when elegance mattered. It was also technically for hotel guests only, but it had become her secret. This was the only place in the city where she could breathe. She walked slowly toward it, her footsteps silent on the thick, patterned rug. She ran her hand over the smooth, cool wood of the lid before lifting it. The smell of old wood and faint, dusty perfume rose up to meet her. She sat down on the bench, the velvet cool and firm beneath her. The weight of the apron, the name tag, the hurried orders, the invisible gazes, it all began to fall away. Here, she was not a waitress. She was not a function. She was just Clara. She placed her hands on the keys. Her hands were not the delicate hands of a lady. Her knuckles were a little red from carrying hot plates, her nails trimmed short for practicality. But they knew what to do. She didn't start with a difficult piece. She started with something simple, a quiet, flowing melody that felt like a sigh. The first notes filled the cavernous lobby with a soft, tentative sound. It was a question. The lobby answered with its own deep silence. And then she began to play in earnest. The notes weren't always technically perfect. She had learned from old books she found in thrift stores and grainy videos on a library computer. But what her playing lacked in formal training, it made up for in truth. The music was the language for the things she could never say. It was the frustration of a day spent being invisible, the loneliness of a small apartment, the quiet, stubborn flame of a dream she had almost given up on. The melody swelled, full of a sorrow so deep it felt like a prayer, then lifted on a current of defiant hope. In the dead of night, in the empty heart of the city, the waitress was gone and only the music remained, telling a story that was far more real than anything you could order from a menu. The air and the gilded spoons started to change a week before the event. It wasn't just the usual pre-dinner rush. It was a current of nervous, excited energy that made the silverware on the tables seem to hum. The head chef, a man whose face was a permanent scowl, was now scowling even more deeply, barking orders about garnishes that had to be perfect, not just good. The manager, a woman usually glued to her computer screen in the office, was now on the floor, her eyes darting over every detail, adjusting the angle of a flower vase here, polishing a water glass there. The name was on everyone's lips. Vance Industries. It was a word that seemed to carry its own gravity. The entire restaurant was being commandeered for a massive gala. It felt less like a catering job and more like preparing for a royal invasion. Clara's normal shifts were stretched into a marathon of overtime, her feet protesting with a dull, persistent throb. The night of the gala, Clara arrived to a place she barely recognized. The familiar, warm lighting of the Gilded Spoon had been replaced by a stark, theatrical setup. The tables were pushed to the edges of the main ballroom, leaving a vast, empty dance floor. A temporary bar, long and glimmering, had been built against one wall. The whole place smelled of fresh linens, expensive perfume, and the sharp, clean scent of ice being dumped into buckets. It was no longer a restaurant. It was a stage. Clara and the rest of the staff moved through it like a well-drilled army, dressed in crisp, black uniforms that felt more formal than ever. They weren't just serving food. They were scenery, and then the people came. They didn't just arrive. They poured into the room in a wave of confidence and glamour. The sound was different from the usual dinner crowd. This was a symphony of clinking champagne flutes, a high tide of laughter that was louder and sharper, and a constant buzz of names and companies and stock prices. Everyone seemed to know everyone, and they all moved with an easy assurance that came from a life where doors always opened for them. Clara floated through them with her tray of tiny, intricate appetizers, her practiced smile fixed firmly in place. She was a piece of the background, human prop in their grand performance. She saw him before she even processed who it was. The room seemed to subtly rearrange itself around him. He was standing in the center of a large group, the undeniable sun in their little solar system. He was taller than he looked on the news feeds that sometimes played silently on the bar. TV, he had a laugh that was not a chuckle, but a full-throated bark. A sound that could cut through every other noise in the room and demand to be heard. His suit was dark and perfectly tailored, and his gestures were large and confident as he told a story. Even from across the room, Clara could feel the energy radiating from him. It was the force, the myth, the legend made flesh. Julian Vance. He looked exactly as she imagined a man who owned an island would look utterly at ease in a world built around his presence. He held a champagne glass but didn't seem to drink from it, instead using it to punctuate his sentences with little waves. As she passed his group, offering a tray, his eyes sharp and quick, swept over her without a flicker of recognition. To him, she was just another black uniform. Another faceless hand in the crowd. The hours blurred into a dizzying string of tasks. Clearing empty glasses before they were even finished, refilling flutes from a heavy bottle, navigating the narrow paths between the powerful and the beautiful. The air grew warmer and thicker. The laughter grew louder. The music from the live band pulsed with a frantic energy. Clara's mind went into its usual work mode, a kind of detached autopilot. She focused on the weight of the tray, the path to the table, the next request. It was the only way to survive the sensory overload, the constant feeling of being an outsider looking in on a party she was not invited to. Around 1 a.m, the tide began to turn. The first wave of guests began to leave, their departure marked by a flurry of cheek kisses and promises to do lunch soon. The volume of the room dipped slightly, the frantic energy softening into a more relaxed, winding-down hum. The band played a few last soft songs before they too began to pack up their instruments. The cleaning crew started to appear, moving quietly along the edges of the room, armed with large trash bags. Clara was assigned to clear the main ballroom. It's the heart of the party that was now beat and empty. She worked methodically, stacking plates and scraping leftover food into a bin. The vast room, which had been so full of life just an hour before, now felt hollow and cavernous. The only remaining guests were Julian Vance and a small, tight-knit group of about 5 people still standing in their circle near the now empty bar. They were the last to leave, and they showed no signs of going. Their conversation was quieter now, more intimate, but Julian's voice still carried. He was telling a story about a ski trip in the Alps, his voice still full of that same booming confidence. Clara, with a large bin of dirty dishes, moved quietly to a nearby service station, her back to them. She just wanted to finish her work, go to the old hotel, and play her quiet song to erase the noise of the night, as she turned back to gather the last of the glassware from a nearby table. Her eyes fell on it. The grand piano from the hotel lobby had been moved onto the stage for the gala, a centerpiece of glittering elegance under a single spotlight. The band had long since gone, and the polished black instrument sat there, silent and majestic, looking a little lonely in the vast, emptying ballroom. It was just a piece of furniture now, a prop that had served its purpose. But as Clara looked at it, she felt the same pull she always did. She saw the ivory keys, the potential for beauty and escape locked within them. She thought about the noise behind her, the confident, easy, powerful noise of Julian Vance in his world. She thought about the ache in her feet and the hollowness in her chest that never quite went away. And she thought about the music. The impulse was sudden and completely irrational. It was a flicker of rebellion, a desperate need to create something that was her own, in a world that so thoroughly wasn't. She looked around. The remaining guests were engrossed in their conversation. The cleaning crew was focused on the far side of the room. Her manager had disappeared an hour ago. No one was watching. She could be back to work in 10 minutes, and no one would ever know. Her heart started to beat a little faster, a nervous flutter against her ribs. It was a risk. A stupid, pointless risk that could get her fired. But the thought of just picking up another dirty plate, of ending the night with the bitter taste of someone else's party in her mouth, was suddenly unbearable. She left the bin of dishes by the service station. She walked towards the stage, her steps feeling clumsy and loud on the polished floor. Each step felt like a decision. The soft carpet of the stairs muffled her footsteps. She walked across the stage, feeling like an intruder. The spotlight above her felt like a warm, interrogating eye. She reached the piano and paused, her hand hovering over the smooth wood. The voices from the small group below continued, a steady stream of noise that represented everything she felt she wasn't. She took a deep, shaky breath, the air thick with the scent of champagne and money, and then she sat down. The cool, firm feel of the bench beneath her was an anchor. She put her hands on the keys, her fingers finding their familiar home. And for a moment, she just sat there, a waitress in a black uniform on a grand stage, the quietest person in a room full of powerful people, waiting for the courage to make a sound. Asterisk, the first note was not loud. It was a single, clear, questioning sound that cut through the stuffy air of the ballroom like a thin, silver needle. It was a sound that did not belong. In a world of clattering dishes and booming laughter, this note was pure and deliberate. It hung in the air for a second, a small, fragile thing in the vast, empty space, before another followed, and another, until a melody began to take shape. It wasn't a happy tune. It was a piece she knew well, one that lived deep inside her, full of a quiet, aching sadness. It was Chopin, a nocturne, a song for the night. The sound did not shout for attention. It simply existed. It drifted down from the stage like a soft fog, and as it settled over the room, the world began to change. A member of the cleaning crew, pushing a large broom with a rhythmic shoo-shoo-shoo-shoos, slowed his sweep. He looked up, his brow furrowed, not in annoyance, but in quiet surprise. The rhythm of his work, a sound he had made 1,000 times before, suddenly felt wrong, noisy. He stopped and leaned on his broom, his eyes fixed on the dark shape of the woman at the piano. Another cleaner, gathering linens from a table. Paused with an armful of white napkins held to her chest, her head cocked to listen. The small, lingering party by the bar didn't fall silent all at once. It was a slow, strange fading. A man, in the middle of telling a joke about a stock market crash, trailed off. His words just stopped, as if someone had gently turned down his volume. He looked at his friends, who were no longer looking at him, but past him, toward the source of the sound. The melody grew, weaving its way through the empty tables and chairs, filling the corners of the cavernous room. It was a story in sound. It spoke of long hours in quiet rooms, of the feeling of being unseen in a crowd. It spoke of a stubborn hope that refused to die, even in the darkest of times. The notes were not just played, they were felt. There was a slight hesitation before a difficult run, a tiny waver in a high, lonely note. These were not the mistakes of a seasoned concert pianist who had practiced 1,000 times in a perfect hall. These were the marks of a human soul, a story being told, not with perfect technique, but with perfect honesty. The air grew thick and heavy with an emotion that had nothing to do with champagne and victory. And then, there was Julian Vance. He was standing with his back mostly to the stage, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing with a nearly empty glass as he held court. He was telling the end of his story, the punchline ready on his lips. Story about how he had outmaneuvered a competitor in a deal that had made his company billions. He was at the peak of his performance, the master of his world, the center of his own universe. And then the music reached him. It didn't hit him like a wave. It seeped into him like a slow, cold mist, his mouth open to deliver the final. Triumphant words of his tale stayed open, but no sound came out. The glass in his hand, held aloft for emphasis, slowly began to lower. As if the weight of the music was too much for his arm to bear, his friends, his audience, were gone. Their eyes were vacant, their attention stolen. He was suddenly speaking to no one. The sound of his own voice in his head, the voice that commanded rooms and closed deals, felt loud, clumsy, and utterly false compared to the delicate. A heartbreaking sound that was now filling the room. For the first time in a very long time, Julian Vance was silent. He was not calculating. He was not strategizing. He was not performing. He was just listening. The music was a key, and it was unlocking a room inside him that he had forgotten was even there. It was a room filled with things he didn't allow himself to feel. Regret, a deep, gnawing loneliness. The memory of a time before the deals and the billions, a time when things were simple and quiet. The sound spoke to the part of him that was still a boy who had once dreamed of something other than winning. It bypassed his intellect, his power, his wealth, and went straight to the raw, messy core of his humanity. He, the man who could buy anything, who could control anything, was completely and utterly captivated by something he could not own, could not command, could not even fully understand. He was silenced. He turned slowly, as if in a trance, to face the stage. And there she was, a silhouette against the single spotlight. A small figure in a simple black uniform, her head bent in concentration over the keys. She was not a performer. She was not a polished artist. She was a creator. And she was creating a world in which he, for the first time in forever, felt like a guest. The last note of the piece hung in the air, a soft, dying whisper of sound. And then there was nothing. The silence that followed the music was not empty. It was full. It was heavy with the echoes of the story that had just been told. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, afraid that making a sound would shatter the fragile, beautiful thing they had just witnessed. The cleaners stood frozen, their work forgotten. The remaining guests stared at the stage, their expressions soft, their postures loose. They were no longer a party of powerful people. They were simply an audience, deeply moved. The silence stretched, seconds turning into what felt like minutes. It was a silence that was louder than any noise that had come before it. It was the sound of 100 people collectively realizing they had just experienced something extraordinary. It was the sound of their own hearts beating in their chests. It was the sound of Julian Vance, the billionaire, the titan. The storm of a man being perfectly, profoundly, and completely still. His mind, usually a chaotic storm of data points and strategies, was a single, focused point of light, and that light was the woman at the piano. He did not clap. He did not speak. He just stood there in the heavy, sacred silence, and let the music that was no longer playing echo through every corner of his soul. The story of his own life, the one he told himself every day about power and success, had just been met by a different story, one of quiet, enduring feeling. And in that silent moment, he knew without a doubt which one was true. Asterisk, the silence in the ballroom finally broke, not with a sound, but with a collective slow breath. It was as if everyone had surfaced from a deep dive and was blinking in the air of the real world. A member of the cleaning crew was the first to move. Dropping a linen napkin, and then quickly stooping to pick it up, the small noise startling in the quiet. The tiny sound seemed to release everyone from their trance. A few hesitant, soft claps started from the small group by the bar, but they felt wrong, like an insult to the quiet intimacy of what had just happened. And they quickly died out. Julian Vance did not clap. He moved. His walk across the vast, empty floor was not his usual commanding stride. It was slower, more deliberate, almost hesitant. He walked with a new, strange grace, as if testing ground that had suddenly become unfamiliar. His entourage watched him go, their expressions a mixture of confusion and intense curiosity. They saw their leader, the unshakable force, moving with a purpose they had never witnessed. He didn't walk toward a boardroom or a car. He walked toward the stage. He climbed the 3 small steps, his expensive shoes making soft, solid sounds on the wood, and approached the piano. Clara felt his presence before she saw him. It wasn't a shadow or a sound, but a shift in the air. A sudden increase in the energy of the room that was focused entirely on her. She had kept her head bowed, her fingers still resting on the keys. Not wanting to break the spell, not wanting to return to the reality of being a waitress in a stolen moment, she could feel the weight of his gaze, and she braced herself, expecting anger, expecting to be fired for her reckless act of defiance. But when she finally forced herself to look up, she didn't see anger. His face was not the mask of confident power she had seen from across the room. It was open, raw, and filled with an emotion so intense it was almost painful to witness. He was looking at her, not at the uniform, not at the stage, but at her. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there for a long moment. A giant of a man looking at her with the quiet wonder of a child seeing snow for the first time. Then he spoke, and his voice, which she knew could boom across a ballroom, was soft, almost a whisper. "Who taught you to play like that?" The question was so unexpected, so devoid of accusation, that it caught her off guard. She could only answer with the truth. "No one, sir," she said, her voice small and shaky. "I taught myself." He seemed to process this, his brow furrowing slightly. "Your technique. It's unorthodox. But the feeling." He trailed off, searching for a word. "It's there. It's completely there." He sat down on the edge of the bench, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the warmth from his body. He wasn't a billionaire asking a question anymore. He was just a man who was curious. The shift was so sudden and so complete that it made her feel dizzy. He didn't offer her a drink or a business card. He asked her how she started, and so she told him. The story poured out of her in a quiet, hesitant rush. She told him about the thrift store books, yellowed pages of sheet music with strange symbols she had to decode one by one. She told him about the library computer with the slow internet, watching grainy videos of old masters trying to copy the shape of their hands. She told him about the old hotel, the late nights, the feeling of the keys under her fingers, being the only place where she felt like she truly made sense. She spoke of the music as a necessity, like air or water, a way to keep the part of her that was just Clara from disappearing completely. She expected him to find it quaint, sad little hobby, but he listened. He listened with an intensity that was more focused than any she had ever experienced. He wasn't waiting for his turn to speak. He was absorbing every word. When she was finished, there was a long silence. He didn't say anything like, "That's a lovely story," or "How inspiring." He looked at her hands, then back at her face. "All that time," he said, his voice still low and thoughtful. "All that talent trapped in a room with no audience." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, and it sounded to Clara's ears like a tragedy. Then, man of business began to re-emerge, but he was different now, colored by the experience. He stood up and began to pace slowly across the small stage, his mind clearly working. "This what you have. It's a raw material, the most valuable kind. It's unpolished, but it's pure. That's the one thing you can't fake. You can buy technique, you can buy training, you can buy venues, but you can't buy what you just did up here." He stopped his pacing and faced her. "I want to be the one who polishes it," he said it simply, as if he were proposing a business merger. And in a way he was. He laid out the offer. It was as audacious and as grand as everything else about his life, but it was delivered with a quiet sincerity. He would fund her entire musical education, not just lessons. The best conservatory in the country, the most renowned private tutors in the world. He would provide for her living expenses, a place to live, so that all she had to do was focus on the music. He would manage her career, get her the auditions, the performances, the record deals. He would build the stage, he said, and give her the world to play on. It was the kind of offer that happens in fairy tales. The kind of thing you see in movies, not something that happens to a waitress who just got done scrubbing tables. It was every dream she had ever had, wrapped in a bow and handed to her by the most unlikely person in the world. But it came with a catch, a very big catch. He wanted to manage her, to own a piece of her future. It wasn't charity, it was an investment. He wanted to be the one who brought her talent to the world, and he would, he said. Make sure they both profited from it. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the conflict. He softened his tone. This isn't a handout. This is a partnership. You have something no amount of money can create. I have the tools to make it heard. Together, we can do something extraordinary. He left her there with a card, a simple, thick white card, with just his name and a phone number embossed on it. Think about it, he said. Call me when you have an answer. Clara walked home that night in a daze. The city felt unreal, the sounds of the traffic distant and muffled. The world had tilted on its axis. An hour ago, her biggest concern was whether she would have enough for the electric bill. Now she was holding a key to a life she had only ever dreamed of. But the key was made by a man who represented everything she was not. He was the noise, and she was the silence. He was the world she served, and she was the one who felt unseen. Accepting his offer felt like a betrayal of the very thing that made her music her own. Her talent had been born from her struggle, from her loneliness. What would happen to it if all of that was taken away? Her small apartment, which usually felt like a quiet refuge, now felt like a cage. She sat on the edge of her bed, the worn-out fabric dipping under her weight, and looked at the card in her hand. It felt impossibly heavy. On one side was the life she knew, the long shifts, the aching feet, the invisibility, but also the freedom of being unknown. The quiet nights at the hotel piano, just for her. On the other side was the life she could have. Education, recognition, the chance to truly become the artist she felt she was inside. But it would come with a price. She would be bound to a contract, to a man who saw her not as a person, but as an asset. The most beautiful, rare, and valuable asset he had ever seen, but an asset nonetheless. She didn't sleep. She sat by the window as the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. She thought about the feeling of playing, the way the music carried her away from everything. Was it for her, or was it for anyone who would listen? She thought about the look on his face when he listened. The raw, unguarded emotion she had seen in him. He hadn't just been entertained. He had been changed. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point of it all. When the morning light was fully in the room, she picked up her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number on the card. He answered on the first ring. "It's Clara," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I was hoping you'd call," he replied. She took a deep breath. She was not accepting a handout. She was entering a partnership. She was not giving up her soul. She was finally finding a way to share it. "I have an answer," she said. Yes. Asterisk, the world she stepped into after that phone call was a different kind of noise. It wasn't the clatter of a restaurant, but the quiet, intense hum of focus. The first day at the conservatory was less about music and more about unlearning. She was placed in a small, soundproofed room with a stern woman who was a master of technique. The woman didn't ask about her feelings or her stories. She pointed to Clara's hands. "Your wrist is too low. You are slapping the keys. You are fighting the piano. You must make the piano your friend." For the first few weeks, Clara felt like a fraud. The simple songs she was assigned, scales and exercises designed for children, felt like a prison. She was used to pouring her entire soul into complex melodies. Now she was just playing notes, and they felt empty. The passion that had been her only guide was being pushed aside, replaced by rigid rules and corrections. "No, no, no," the teacher would say, tapping a ruler gently on her knuckles. "The thumb does not cross under like that. It is lazy. It must be precise." It was maddening. It was boring. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. She would go back to the small, comfortable apartment that Julian had arranged for her. Her head aching from the concentration, and she would feel a familiar old doubt creep in. Was she ruining it? Was the process of polishing the raw material, destroying it entirely? But then, slowly, something began to shift. As her fingers learned the new patterns, as her wrists learned to be relaxed and strong, a new kind of power began to emerge. One afternoon, while practicing a simple batch invention, she realized she wasn't just playing the notes anymore. The precision of the technique was no longer a cage. It was a set of tools. She could play softer, louder, faster, with a control she had never possessed. The emotion was still there, but now it wasn't a wild, uncontrolled flood. It was a river, guided by a strong and steady hand. She could pour a whole world of feeling into a single, perfectly placed note. One afternoon, her teacher, a woman of few words, stopped her mid-phrase and simply said, "Now we can begin." It was the highest compliment Clara had ever received. As the months passed, her world began to expand. She was introduced to other tutors, each a master of a different part of the musical universe. She learned about music history, about theory, about the lives of the composers whose stories she had only guessed at before. She was no longer just playing. She was understanding. The old hotel piano became a distant memory. She now practiced on a beautiful grand piano that sat in the living room of her quiet apartment, constant and patient friend. The life of the waitress faded like a dream. She no longer worried about rent or tips. Her world was the 88 keys and the vast, beautiful landscape of music that lay between them. She was a student, an apprentice, a creator in training. She also began to see Julian in a new light. He was still the investor, the one who had made it all possible, but their meetings had changed. In the beginning, he would come by the apartment to check on her progress, asking questions about her lessons in the same way he would ask about the performance of a company he had acquired. He was always encouraging, but it was the encouragement of a businessman toward a valuable asset. But as the months went on, his visits became less frequent, but somehow more meaningful. He started to ask different questions. He stopped asking about her technique and started asking about the music itself. "What does that piece make you feel?" he'd ask, sitting on the sofa, listening as she played a new Liszt etude she was struggling with. "It feels like a storm," she had said, "but it's a storm that's trying to be beautiful." He would just nod, a thoughtful look on his face, as if she were telling him something profound. Clara realized that in helping her find her voice, he was finding something he had lost in his own world of numbers and negotiations. He was connecting to a part of himself that had nothing to do with power. He was nurturing her talent, and in doing so, he was nurturing a quiet, reflective side of himself that no one else ever saw. He was still Julian Vance, but he was changing, and she felt a strange sense of pride, as if she were a small part of that transformation. The day of her first public recital arrived. It was not a stadium concert or a sold-out arena. It was a small, intimate hall that held maybe 200 people. The kind of hall where every note mattered, where a pin drop could be heard from the stage. Julian had arranged it. He called it a soft launch, a test to see how the world would receive this new artist he had been cultivating. He didn't fill the audience with reporters and critics, but with a curated group of patrons, artists, and influential friends. The most important person in the audience, Clara knew, was sitting in a private box to the left of the stage, just above the orchestra pit, backstage. The air was thick with the smell of old velvet and floor polish. It felt exactly like the wings of a theater should feel, but for Clara. It was a world away from the swinging kitchen doors of the Gilded Spoon. She was not in her waitress uniform, but in a simple, elegant dress, the color of deep green. Her hands, once rough and red from work, were now smooth and graceful, the hands of a pianist. She could hear the quiet murmur of the audience settling in their seats, a soft sound that brought back a jolt of old fear. The feeling of being on the outside of a world looking in. She took a deep breath, the way her teacher had taught her. She thought about the long nights at the hotel, the worn-out books, the feeling of loneliness that had been the fuel for her first, clumsy songs. But those feelings weren't with her anymore. They were the foundation, but she had built a house upon them. A stagehand gave her the signal. She walked out onto the stage. The single spotlight that had found her in the ballroom was now replaced by the warm, gentle light of the entire hall. She walked to the center of the stage and bowed, a small, polite gesture. As she rose, her eyes scanned the room for a moment, a sea of strangers. Then she found him. In the private box, sitting alone, was Julian. He was not dressed to command attention. He was just a man in a dark suit, watching intently. As her eyes met his, he didn't smile or wave. He just gave her a small, slow, respectful nod. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition, a message that said, "I see you. We did this. Now, show them." She turned and walked to the piano. It was the same kind of grand piano she had been playing for a year, but it felt different on this stage. It felt like an old friend, a partner ready to speak. She sat down, the familiar feel of the bench, a welcome comfort. The hall fell into a deep, expectant silence. It was the same kind of silence that had fallen in the ballroom that night, but this was not the silence of a surprise. This was the silence of a promise. She placed her hands on the keys, ready to begin. She did not play the sad, hesitant nocturne that had silenced a billionaire. That was her past. For her first note, she played something strong, clear, and full of life. It was a piece by a composer she had studied, a piece that spoke not of loneliness, but of resilience. The sound filled the hall, not with the raw, untrained emotion of a waitress at a piano, but with the honed, powerful, and beautifully controlled voice of an artist who had finally, truly found her song.